this is Avivah Luehr, the Director of Development for Safe Passage for Children of Minnesota. If you're watching this from my home to yours, you're coming here to see our virtual presentation of our fundraiser this year. We're very excited to see you and to have you. And if you're interested in donating, please stay tuned as we will have information on how to do that at the end of the presentation. If you have any questions, please let us know and send us an email. We'd love to help. Thank you and enjoy the presentation.
Welcome again. Our theme today is interrupting child abuse and neglect in time to avoid lifelong damage to children. And this year, advocating for children is even more challenging than usual due to the coronavirus. Maltreatment reports are down 40% in Minnesota. Teachers and other mandated reporters simply aren't seeing children. We estimate that 15,000 Minnesota children annually who would normally be reported to child protection are hidden from view. And there is no known statewide strategy to find them. Another challenge is that proportionately far more African American and Native American families are screened into child protection or end up in foster care than families in other communities. Addressing these racial disparities is of paramount importance to us, and it is one that we cannot tackle alone. We need advice from community leaders to shape our legislative priorities, and we are committed to listen. But listening does not mean being silent. Safe Passage will continue to advocate for every child to be safe in all our communities. An important tool for reducing racial disparities is investing in the right services. For example, in-home parenting skills training and early childhood programs have reduced maltreatment by up to 50%, so families don't even need to get to child protection or foster care. But once families are on the verge of child protection or already in it, we should provide whatever services are necessary to help them get on solid footing and build on their strengths so that whenever possible, we don't have to place children. This is critical because children, above all, need a sense of belonging with family and community, and placement should be the last resort. The problem is, over the last 30 years, funds for basic services like intensive in-home support and housing and transportation and childcare have been cut. So if we are serious about addressing equity issues in child protection and foster care, we have a choice. Either invest in and rebuild this services infrastructure or give the priority to short-term budget constraints. Safe Passage has been advocating with elected and appointed officials for resources and to improve child safety through our dedicated core of volunteer advocates. Together, they have contributed significantly to change. For example, a 2015 Governor's Task Force led to a change in law that mandates uniform statewide standards for responding to child maltreatment reports. As a result of this one change, approximately 14,500 children in a normal year are getting child protection services than in the past. The additional casework involved is eligible for federal funding, so counties have received $100 million in new federal revenues. That in turn requires a state match, so total child welfare funds in Minnesota increased from $430 million to $690 million since 2015. This enabled counties to hire 400 more caseworkers and reduce caseloads from an estimated 19 per worker to 12. So while we still need to refund support services, the resources for services provided directly by the counties have improved considerably. It is in this current environment that our keynote speaker today, Dr. Marty Erickson, shares what she has learned about maltreatment through her research. Among her many academic credentials, Dr. Erickson is Director Emerita Harris Programs in Infant and Early Childhood Mental Health at the University of Minnesota. She also co-hosts with her daughter, Dr. Erin Erickson, the weekly podcast Mom Enough, which I heartily recommend to you. That's Mom Enough, which has been providing insight and support to parents since 2006. In the late 1970s, Marty was part of a pioneering longitudinal study launched by Dr. Byron Egeland at the University of Minnesota. The study followed children who were at risk of maltreatment from birth right up to the present day. It shows why it is critical to interrupt abuse and neglect as quickly as possible. Then, in 1986, Dr. Egeland and Dr. Erickson used the findings from this research to design a program called STEEP. STEEP breaks the intergenerational cycle of maltreatment and continues in operation in the U.S. and abroad today. Here is Dr. Erickson.
One of the most important findings from this longitudinal study had to do with the impact of abuse and neglect on children in the earliest months and years of life. And, we really didn't know that much. There hadn't been that much good research that really started very early in a child's life. But our study very clearly showed that when children are maltreated in any of those ways in the early months and years of life, the consequences are huge and they're very long lasting, right on up into adulthood. And the thing about emotional neglect is that it's not easily detected by people. And babies can't speak up and say what's happening to them. And so we may not see immediate harm in the child, but we know that there's a huge risk for this harm to show up and to accumulate and multiply over time. What that feels like and what that looks like to a baby is in simple things. So babies cry to tell us that they need something from us. But when a baby cries, needing comfort or needing to be fed or played with or whatever it might be, and they don't get that response, over time, they don't learn to trust that caregiver. They don't learn to trust their own power to solicit what they need. And that just erodes their capacity to trust other people going forward and to care and have positive relationships with other people going forward. We saw in the kids in our study who were emotionally neglected in infancy or very early childhood that they had a dramatic decline on standardized tests of infant and toddler development. From 9 months to 24 months, these kids dropped significantly in terms of their ability to think and perform basic cognitive tasks and problem-solving tasks, which was something that really had not been documented before. But we need to understand parents and what they're bringing to that equation of the relationship with their child if we're going to make a difference. And so we can't just tell them the right thing to do. We can't just try to give them knowledge or change their immediate behaviors, but we have to really understand them in a much deeper way and help them come to understand themselves. And some of the ingredients of that are definitely building knowledge, particularly knowledge of child development. A second thing that is very important is having support for yourself as a parent. Emotional support in particular. It's very hard to be a good enough parent under any circumstances. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. But it's much harder when you don't have a support system for yourself. And a third factor that's really getting to the deepest issues has to do with how you were treated in your own childhood. In 1986, Byron Egeland, the same professor I referred to before, worked with me to develop what we call the STEEP program, Steps Toward Effective, Enjoyable Parenting. And that program, is similar to many other programs that are operating around the country and, in fact, around the world now. But ours was one of the very first that was grounded in a deep understanding of attachment theory and research. It was guided by that earlier longitudinal study that really informed how we approach the parents. What we've learned from 34 years of adapting this program and seeing how it works in different contexts is going back again to that idea of relationship-based work, but really meeting the parents where they are and doing the skill building, the knowledge building, strengthening support networks, but then really zooming in on what we call looking back and moving forward. Because the research has shown that it's not so much how you were treated as a child that shapes the way you parent your child, but it's how you've come to think about it. So face the pain, acknowledge its influence on you, and then choose what you want to repeat and what you want to leave behind. So if you don't mind, I would like to kind of wrap up my comments by just sharing something that has to do with a baby boy who came to my attention quite a few years ago when I was doing this work in the community. He was 7 months old when he was having seizures at home. And it turned out that his young father had shaken him because he wouldn't stop crying. And that's what triggered the seizures. This little boy really, really touched my heart. But his young parents touched my heart too, because both of them were very young. They both had a history of significant maltreatment in their own childhoods. And just a short while ago, they had been children in the child protection system themselves. So I was inspired to write a song. I'm not going to sing it for you, but I'd like to just read the lyrics because I was trying to capture what Jeffrey's experience must have been like for him. The small boy reaches out for the love that he needs, but his bid for attention no one will heed. So he begins to cry, hoping someone will hear. But as no one responds, his heart fills with fear. Alone in his room with no one in sight, he cries louder and stronger out of sadness and fright, until finally his father's standing over his bed. But then the arms that should hold him reach out and shake him instead. If he's living such pain at the hands of his father, how will he ever learn to love? The small boy reaches out for the love we all need, but his bids for attention no one ever will heed. So he ceases to cry, and hope melts away as no one responds to him day after day. Alone in his room with no one in sight, he hardly can tell if it's day or it's night. And he prays that his father won't come near his bed. His heart feels like stone as his hope turns to dread. If he's living such pain at the hands of his parents, how will he ever learn to love? And I would say to all of you who are listening, we are the answer to that question. How will he ever learn to love?
Thank you, Marty, for sharing your research with us as well as your moving personal experience. Our next speaker is Dr. Kate Piper. She will explore the mismatch between the sense of urgency that Marty conveys and actual practices in Minnesota. Kate Piper was a juvenile court lawyer in Vermont for 19 years, then received her PhD in social policy from Brandeis University. Her research focuses on family assessment, which is one of two child protection tracks, the other being traditional response or TR. Family assessment emphasizes keeping the family together and is the preferred option in Minnesota, whereas traditional response makes child safety the priority. A quick note, Kate also refers to family assessment as differential response or DR and as alternative response or AR because that's how these programs are known in other states. Safe Passage advocates for changing certain family assessment practices that compromise child safety. For example, giving parents advance notice of the initial child protection visit, interviewing children in the presence of the adults, and not doing fact-finding. In her doctoral thesis and again in her recent work, Kate analyzed the findings of these practices from numerous studies going back to the 2000s. And as such, she literally wrote the book on family assessment. Here is what she found. Tell us more about your research in this area, particularly as it related to family assessment in Minnesota or differential response elsewhere.
So we found the studies supposedly supporting DR used flawed methodologies and misleading conclusions. A lot of studies have found that an alarmingly high percentage of high-risk cases have been assigned to the AR track. Young children are more likely to die of neglect than abuse, and neglect has more far-ranging consequences often than abuse. So, I saw cases of neglect that were reported over and over and over again to the Child Protection Agency. The parents made promises they would participate in services, and as soon as the Child Protection Agency went away, they dropped out, and then they'd be reported again. So that by the time I saw these cases in court, the damage to the child was just enormous. Assumption that DR has made is that families on the AR track are going to be more likely to engage in services than families on the TR track, because supposedly the AR approach is more family friendly. And study after study has proven that actually the uptake of services on the AR track is pretty low.
So can you tell me about states that have, changed their commitment to differential response or alternative response?
Yes, thank you. There are 13 states that we found that have either ended DR, suspended it, or chosen not to extend the pilots statewide. The reasons given for these decisions to end DR were a lack of resources, inaccurate sorting of cases at the time those track decisions are made, the fact that a lot of high-risk cases are ending up on the AR track, low uptake of services for families assigned to the AR track, and then concerns about child safety. In actually 6 states, there have been child fatalities in cases assigned to the AR track. And these are highly publicized child fatalities that often prompted the states to end DR.
So you know a little bit about Minnesota and what we are working on here. What conclusions did you reach that are important for our state in particular?
One of my concerns was the whole notion of conducting child interviews with the parents present, or with prior notification to the parents, giving parents the opportunity to put pressure on the child to recant or intimidate the child into silence. So one recommendation we're making is that there be no, the child is interviewed separately, and there should be no prior notification to the parents until after that child has been interviewed. What we found is DR has evolved over time so that there's been a diffusion of best practices from each track onto the other track. So the 2 tracks are becoming more similar, which we think is a good thing. So the intensive fact-finding and safety assessment of the TR track has diffused onto the AR track, and the family engagement strategies and the broader assessment of family risks, needs, and strengths has been diffused onto the TR track.
Despite Kate's findings, family assessment persists as the favored approach in Minnesota, in part because its proponents believe it does a better job of keeping children with their families and communities. And as we said earlier, children do belong with their families and in their communities whenever possible. But we are very concerned that family assessment doesn't protect children from the extremes, from those individuals who think of children as property to do with as they wish. So let's be clear. Children are not owned by anyone. They are not protected from violence and neglect just by our collective moral sense of how they should be treated. They are protected by law, which prohibits, for example, locking them up against their will and starving them or chaining them to a bed or duct taping them to a wall and beating them or using them or selling them for sex. Children also have an affirmative right not to be neglected. For example, being abandoned in a crib where they may not develop normal mental and emotional capacities or sometimes even learn to walk. As Dr. Erickson described, children need to be picked up and cuddled and stimulated as infants and toddlers so their bodies and brains grow and they are able to reach the potential they were born with. The law prohibits all of these forms of maltreatment, yet they have been committed against children for years some of whom have been in the news quite recently, and some of whom are having these experiences even as we speak. Many of these children are known to child protection, and most of them are known to someone in authority, a public health person, law enforcement, or a mandated reporter. Yet we deliberately avoid finding the facts in the case, and we keep delaying our response. Family assessment supporters also believe that the traditional response alienates parents. But in fact, requiring cooperation can actually give workers the leverage they need to engage parents and establish trust. To make this point, I asked an old friend and colleague, Debbie Reid, to talk about her experience working with parents. Debbie worked in juvenile court programs where parents' compliance was mandatory, and also has worked alongside child protection workers providing voluntary support. Here are some of her insights. So Debbie, you sometimes have gone into homes of families who had open cases with the state social services agency to follow up on problems that originated in school or could have had an impact on their case. So you may not have been seen as an entirely welcome visitor. How did you establish relationships with families and the trust that you needed to do your work?
So anything you can do to empower the client and who feels so unempowered is the beginning of engagement. Just like you wouldn't go into your friend's home, I would hope, and not say, well, you know, I really don't like the music you're playing right now. Being rude, being judgmental, when you're in somebody else's environment, you're trying to empower them, but they're also in a very vulnerable position. And you see some things that, you know, it might not sit well with you, but that's why you're there. I always tried to make them feel like I felt honored being in their environment, that I felt it was, not honored, a privilege to be there. The one thing I was blessed with was incredible supervision. And I got a lot of support because as a young outreach worker going into some homes, I went into the home and came running back for supervision as fast as I could. And that support was always there for me. I'm just saying that I've seen workers from the state just say, okay, we've got this horrible situation and I'm trying to help you and trying to get information, you know, basically through their attitude saying, I'm not judging you, but you know, here's the deal. You know, either you do this or your kid's gone, or you do this or you don't get the services. And I've seen, you know, people who would be incredibly resistant because they've been burned by these systems, you know, open up. I've also seen workers go in and they won't sit down and they look around and, you know, they're talking to the parent and they're writing, you know, or taking notes, which you have to do, but you don't have to do it that moment, you know, and I was uncomfortable with that. And it wasn't my home. I'm really glad she ain't come to see me. Which just puts off people. You don't get the information you want anyway. You can't figure out if it's safe or not because people start to shut down and lie to you.
So the importance of establishing your attitude as being a guest, there's a lot of ways to do that, even if it's not voluntary.
Right, right. Because you're more likely to get more information than not. And some of the older state workers I met, you know, have harrowing stories and they've been in all kinds of homes and they just approach it as something you do and they get information. As Debbie explains, a respectful but pragmatic approach allows workers to get the information they need to keep a child safe, even when parents don't have a choice about cooperating. A related challenge for child protection is working with communities whose norms may be distinct from the majority culture and as a result are wary of child protection. Safe Passage has been working to address one example of this with our board member, Vu.
Nolly is the CEO of Superb in the Urbs, a real estate company that services largely Hmong and Asian families in the northwest suburbs, and in addition is the incoming president of the Asian American Real Estate Association of America and serves on 2 other nonprofit boards. Since 2010, Nolly has also practiced as a natural-born Hmong healer, which she explains means that her skills as a shaman were passed on to her from previous generations. Nolly joined the Safe Passage Board because she encountered child maltreatment in her role as a shamanic healer and felt helpless to deal with it. Together, we collaborated on convening listening sessions with Hmong leaders and professionals, and we are doing another round of these sessions with the North Suburban Community Television shortly. We hope to explore the proposal Nolly mentions that each clan have an advocate counselor to represent children and also to emerge with an action plan. Here are Nolly's views on how to work with her community's leaders. Nolly, you are a real estate executive, but also a natural Hmong healer. So can you talk about your experience in that role and particularly around child abuse and neglect in your community?
First off, I would like to state that I am not a social worker or a child expert within the Hmong community. My comments are solely based off of my own experiences, dialogue with others, and information that I've come across within the community. I am, however, a natural Hmong-born shamanic healer and child advocate. So my experience with child abuse and neglect are that, this is a very fragile topic that is discussed within our Hmong community. It's not openly discussed. Rather, it's a very uncomfortable topic to talk about. And honestly, the reason why is because the Hmong community values and takes great pride in raising our children because they represent our next of kin. The fact of the thought of having their children raised by an outsider is something really difficult to accept.
So how does that actually work when there's a situation involving children, and how do the elders in the clan get involved?
So the problem is that the children can't speak for themselves. So no one will ever know what is happening to them, right? They simply go where the family clan leaders or relatives feel it's best for them.
That sounds in some ways like it meets a lot of the current priorities of the system. For example, the system really wants to use kinship placements whenever possible, wants to mobilize community resources and maintain children's ties to their culture. So what areas do you think are missing, or what are you concerned about?
I honestly feel helpless, Rich, when I see, hear, and know of children who may be experiencing child abuse. This pertains to Hmong families I personally know and others whom I've also come across. My concern is, how do we communicate as a community with the parents or families of the children who are negatively impacted to address and prevent future abuse and neglect?
So are you the only person concerned about this, or are there other young Hmong professionals, people share your concerns?
So as I'm sure you can recall, Rich, a couple years ago, you and I worked together to convene 2 listening sessions with young Hmong elected officials, social service agency leaders, and child protection staff to talk about this issue. We learned a lot of millennials in the community do respect and love our culture, but at the same time are not okay with some of the situations that the children are in.
What can be done to bridge this gap?
Well, we are convening another set of listening sessions in a few weeks to revisit these questions, and hopefully we can develop an action plan then. One focus I plan to suggest is to propose before the Hmong 18 Clan Council to designate an advocate counselor within each clan that children can talk with and help advocate for their needs and safety. We should also do an outreach to educate people in my community about what is acceptable and what is not in terms of the law, and hopefully to bridge conversations that it is okay to talk about child abuse and neglect. We also have some great younger generation Hmong leaders, as we were just talking about, who are already running social services agencies and have touched on this issue in some ways. So I do hope that we can collaborate with them to find solutions that will preserve our Hmong culture and at the same time make sure that our children are safe and well cared for.
Debbie and Nolly both confirm that the most effective way to increase child safety is to try first to gain trust and cooperation and fall back on the legal leverage that the system provides only when trust can't be achieved. To pull this all together, I wanted to share a few brief excerpts from last year's speakers, Naima Broadnax and Alicia Jacobs. Alicia and Naima are not, for example, the infants who suffered irretrievable brain damage from severe neglect. They are more typical products of the system who had to overcome significant and unnecessary childhood suffering because the system didn't respond or responded too slowly, and then its insistence on sending children back to abusive situations.
We lived in a white community, and it was honorable for a black man to be raising his daughter by himself. He was a batterer in his personal relationships, and then when there was no woman there, that came to me. It wasn't like an everyday thing, but when it happened, it was severe. Throughout the course of all of this, I began to run away at around 12. When I got a little older, I stayed in the streets. I started to learn what the streets were about and how to survive, like most runaways, and then it becomes a way of life. Mainly when they did step in, it was to penalize me. I actually got a ticket for being a habitual runaway, and then they sent me back to a dysfunctional home repeatedly. So they just caused the cycle to go over and over and over again. There was an incident where it escalated like 1,000 times, where it went to kicking and punching, and that's when I was thrown across the room and my hip began to dislocate after that incident. There was a major effort that had to take place for me to go into foster care, despite all of the evidence and the signs of abuse.
I survived 17 years of severe child abuse. Everybody loved my mom. On the outside, she always made sure that everybody thought we had the perfect life. She had driven me to a local park and taken me into a bathroom and put a gun to my head, and she had asked me to give her one reason why I should live. My best friend had told my counselor at school, and then because it was so drastic, the counselor then had to bring in the police, and at that point I was scared because I had previously turned in my mom multiple times. The first few times I was 100% honest about everything. Like, I could nail down every single bump, bruise, scratch, scar, everything. The system wasn't able to do anything to help me, and so I had to go back home, and every time I went back, it would be worse for telling, for sharing that, or in her words, I was humiliating her and making her look bad. At the time, I think that they were always trying to do what's best for the family, and for me in that case, what was best for the family wasn't what was best for me. And I stopped sharing, I stopped reaching out, I stopped telling people what's gonna happen when the system won't help me and then I have to go back. Like, am I actually gonna die this time? Like those are thoughts that would go through my head. So the system wasn't able to work for me, but that doesn't mean that we can't make it work for somebody else.
I would always want young people to know that they have rights, and I would like them to know that they deserve every bit of what everybody else has.
If I'm able to be part of an organization that's able to speak out and stop other people that treat their children like that, that's something I want to be part of.
So I just really love that their effort is to make concrete changes within the law. That is amazing.
Every time I view this video, I think we really need to listen to children. Children typically aren't able to make up a big lie and sustain it over time. So encourage them to share things generally, and when they tell us something bad is happening, take it seriously and check it out and take whatever action is appropriate. The way the system responded to Naima and Alicia, as our other speakers have also attested, is how it frequently responds today. Child welfare is not sufficiently child-centered. Too often, its priority is parents and other adults in the household and the community. It will take time and effort to change this institutional mindset. So as you see, the challenges to protecting children are numerous and complex, and will require Safe Passage to continue to speak out on behalf of victims of child maltreatment for years to come. Our goal is to become financially sustainable within 3 years so that we can continue to advocate for children as long as needed. That means increasing our revenues from $100,000 to $300,000 annually. I ask you to consider how you will invest in these children today, because we cannot stand up for them without your support. So thank you for your kind attention, and I will now turn you back over to your hosts.